No, that's not possible. Jonathan Hale's voice exploded through the intensive care unit, stripped of restraint, stripped of dignity. It was the sound of a man who had just been told the one thing his power could not undo. The cry hit the walls and fell back on him, heavy and unanswered. Doctors froze where they stood. A nurse near the monitors startled, her hand tightening around a chart. In the hallway beyond the glass, a small black girl flinched hard, clutching the rag she had been holding as if it could protect her from the noise. Jonathan stood at the foot of the bed, shoulders rigid, eyes burning as he stared at the two physicians in front of him. "No," he said again, slower this time, each word carved out of disbelief. "You're wrong," the lead physician inhaled, composing himself. "Mr. Hale, the results are clear. Your daughter is experiencing multi-organ failure. We have not been able to identify the underlying cause." Jonathan shook his head sharply. "That's not an answer. It's a diagnosis," the doctor replied, measured. "A diagnosis without a cause is an excuse," Jonathan snapped. "You're telling me her organs are shutting down, and you don't know why?" The second doctor shifted uncomfortably. "Sometimes medicine doesn't." "Don't," Jonathan cut in, raising a hand. "Don't tell me about limits. I didn't ask for philosophy. I asked for facts." I was no. Grace lay between them, impossibly small against the bed, her chest rising and falling in shallow, assisted breaths. Tubes ran from her arms, machines doing the work her body could not. Jonathan glanced at her, then back at the doctors, his jaw tightening. "She was healthy," he said. "She had a fever. That's it. Now you're standing here talking about organ failure." The lead physician nodded once. "We ran comprehensive labs, imaging, genetic screening. The findings are consistent." Consistent with what?" Jonathan demanded. "You don't know what's causing it." Silence answered him. Jonathan stepped closer. "Run the tests again." "We already—" "Again," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "New samples, independent labs. I want every variable checked." The doctor's expression hardened slightly. "Mr. Hale, we are following standard protocol." Jonathan laughed once, sharp and humorless. "Standard protocol didn't save my wife," he said, "and it won't save my daughter." That landed heavier than he intended. The room fell quiet. "I want the full medical file," Jonathan continued. "Every lab result. Raw data, not summaries." "Now." The doctors exchanged a look. The lead physician hesitated, then nodded to his colleague. Moments later, a thick folder was placed into Jonathan's hands. "There," the doctor said. "Everything we have." "Tanti wid." Jonathan flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning columns of numbers he didn't fully understand but refused to accept at face value. He stopped abruptly, looking up. "So this is it," he said. "You've decided there's no cause, no cure, and no responsibility." "That's not fair," the second doctor protested. "It's accurate," Jonathan replied coldly. "If she gets worse, it's just unfortunate." The lead physician straightened. "We will continue supportive care." "When so?" Jonathan closed the folder slowly. "Supportive care is what you offer when you've given up." He turned away from them, his gaze landing briefly on the glass wall. That was when he noticed the child. The little girl stood just outside the room, eyes fixed not on him, but on the folder under his arm. She hesitated, then took a step forward, small shoes squeaking softly against the floor. Before anyone could stop her, she spoke. "They changed them. I saw it." Her voice was quiet but clear. The room seemed to tilt. Jonathan turned sharply. "What did you say?" The girl swallowed, her small fingers tightening around the rag. "They changed them," she repeated, pointing vaguely down the hallway. "The papers. I saw them do it." Jonathan stared at her, stunned. For a moment, he thought he had misheard. "You... what?" he asked, his voice faltering. "You saw who?" The doctors stiffened instantly. "Sir," the lead physician said quickly. "She's just a child." "I saw them," the girl insisted. her voice trembling now but determined. 2 doctors. They switched the papers and wrote new numbers. Jonathan felt his grip tighten on the folder. He looked at the child, really looked at her, her age, her clothes. The fear in her eyes mixed with something else. Certainty. You're saying. He stopped, swallowing hard. You're saying they changed my daughter's test results? The girl nodded. They whispered. Then they walked toward you. Jonathan's heart began to pound. He looked from the child to the doctors. Is this true? This is inappropriate. The lead physician said sharply. She doesn't understand what she's talking about. Jonathan took a step toward the girl, lowering himself slightly, as if afraid a sudden movement might shatter the moment. What's your name? He asked. Annie, she whispered. Annie, Jonathan repeated. Tell me exactly what you saw. Deason too. Before she could answer, her mother rushed over, panic written across her face. I'm so sorry, sir, the woman said, grabbing Annie's shoulder. She shouldn't be bothering you. Annie, come with me. Annie resisted for a second. Her eyes locked on Jonathan's. They changed them, she said again. I know they did. Then she was pulled away. Jonathan straightened slowly. The room felt different now.
This doesn't make any sense.
He looked at the doctors, his earlier grief hardening into something sharper. You gave me these files, he said quietly, lifting the folder. And a child just told me they were altered. That's absurd, the second doctor said. We would never. Jonathan raised a hand. Enough. The silence that followed was absolute. You're done for now, Jonathan said. Both of you, Mr. Hale, leave. They did. Jonathan remained standing, the folder heavy in his hands, his mind racing. He looked back at Grace, at the rise and fall of her chest, and then toward the hallway where Annie had disappeared. For the first time since hearing the diagnosis, disbelief gave way to something far more dangerous. Suspicion. And Jonathan Hale had built an empire on knowing exactly what to do when something didn't add up. Jonathan Hale did not leave the ICU after the doctors walked out. He stood there for a long moment, the medical file pressed against his chest as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. Grace's monitor continued its steady rhythm, indifferent to revelations, indifferent to suspicion. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and recycled air, a smell Jonathan associated with endings he refused to accept. A child said they changed them. The sentence repeated in his mind, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the persistence of something that would not be dismissed. He had built his life on instinct sharpened by evidence. He had learned, painfully, that truth rarely announced itself in comfortable ways. He pulled a chair closer to Grace's bed and sat down, placing the folder on his knees. Slowly, deliberately, he opened it again. This time, he did not read as a desperate father. He read as a man who had spent 20 years dismantling contracts, acquisitions, and corporate lies line by line. Numbers stared back at him. Liver enzymes, renal markers, cardiac indicators, all elevated, all alarming, all neatly organized. Too neatly. Jonathan flipped back to the timestamps. Blood drawn at 9:12 a.m. Imaging completed at 10:03. Follow-up labs at 2:45 p.m. He frowned. His eyes moved faster now, skipping conclusions, lingering on raw values. There it was. A discrepancy so small it would mean nothing to someone skimming for reassurance. A potassium level adjusted downward by a margin that seemed almost insignificant. A notation rewritten in different handwriting. A digital signature time-stamped earlier than the machine log that generated the result. Jonathan's pulse quickened. It wasn't proof. Not yet. But it was something. If this moment made you pause, if it stirred something deeper than anger or fear, don't keep it to yourself. Tap like if you believe the truth still matters. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And share what you would do if you were in his place. Subscribe to the channel for more stories where quiet voices change everything. He looked at Grace again. Hold on, he whispered, unsure whether he was speaking to her or to himself. Outside the room, the hospital hummed with muted activity. Night shift staff moved with quiet efficiency, their conversations low, their steps practiced. Jonathan rose and stepped into the hallway, closing the glass door behind him. Annie was gone. He scanned the corridor instinctively, then exhaled slowly. Of course she was gone. Children like her didn't linger where they weren't supposed to. They learned early when to disappear. A nurse approached cautiously. "Mr. Hale, can I get you anything? Coffee? Water?" Jonathan shook his head. "I need access to the hospital's internal audit system." The nurse blinked. "Sir? Sir, now," he added, not raising his voice, not lowering it either. "And I want a list of every physician who has accessed my daughter's records in the last 72 hours. Oh," the nurse hesitated, then nodded. "I'll contact administration." "I am administration," Jonathan said, gently but firmly. She swallowed and hurried off. Jonathan leaned against the wall, closing his eyes for a brief second. For the first time since Grace had been admitted, he allowed himself to think beyond the immediate terror of losing her. If someone had altered her results, then this wasn't incompetence. It was intent, and intent always had a reason. He thought of the acquisition 3 months earlier, the hostile negotiations, the board members who had smiled while voting against him, the private equity group that had tried and failed to wrest control of the hospital network from him. He had assumed the matter settled. He had been wrong before. The elevator doors opened at the far end of the hall. A janitorial cart rolled out, pushed by Annie's mother. The woman looked exhausted. Her shoulders slumped, her eyes heavy with a fatigue Jonathan recognized. She was doing what she had to do, because no one was going to do it for her. Annie walked beside her, quieter now, her earlier certainty replaced with something closer to fear. Jonathan straightened. "Excuse me," he said. The woman stiffened immediately. "Yes, sir?" Jonathan lowered his voice, conscious of where they were. "Your daughter, Annie." Annie looked up at him, startled. "I'd like to speak with her," Jonathan said. "If that's all right." The woman's eyes widened. "Sir, I'm so sorry if she caused trouble. She shouldn't have said anything." "She didn't cause trouble," Jonathan interrupted gently. "She may have helped my daughter." That stopped her. The woman hesitated, glancing down at Annie, then back at Jonathan. Years of caution warred with maternal instinct. "Just a moment," Jonathan added, "with you present." Finally, she nodded. They moved to a quieter alcove near the windows. City lights shimmered faintly in the distance, blurred by glass and exhaustion. Jonathan crouched slightly to Annie's level. He did not smile. He did not soften his expression. He knew children sensed false comfort. "Annie," he said, "I need you to tell me again what you saw." Slowly, Annie's fingers twisted the edge of her shirt. "I was with my mom," she began. "We were cleaning near the lab." "Which lab?" Jonathan asked. "The one with the blue door," Annie said. "Where they don't like us going." Jonathan nodded. He knew the one. "What happened?" "2 doctors came in," Annie said. "They had papers." They were whispering. "What did they do with the papers?" "They switched them," Annie replied immediately. "One took the top page off and put another one. Then he wrote something new." Jonathan felt a chill run through him. "Did you see the names on the papers?" Annie shook her head. "Too high, but I saw numbers. One was crossed out." Her mother inhaled sharply. "Annie, it's all right," Jonathan said. "You're doing fine." Annie looked at him again, searching his face. "They were scared," she added. "Grown-ups get quiet when they're scared." Jonathan straightened slowly. "Do you remember what they looked like?" Annie nodded. "One was tall. The other one had glasses." Jonathan exhaled. "That matched. Thank you," he said quietly. "That was very brave." Annie shrugged, uncertain. Jonathan turned to her mother. "I want to make something very clear. Your daughter did the right thing. No one will punish her for that." The woman's eyes filled with tears she hadn't expected. "We just need our jobs," she said softly. Jonathan nodded. "You'll keep them." He meant it. As they walked away, Jonathan's phone vibrated. A secure message from hospital IT appeared on the screen. "Access granted." He turned back toward Grace's room, his pace steady, his grief now anchored by something sharper. If someone had chosen his daughter as leverage, they had miscalculated. Jonathan Hale did not lash out blindly. He dismantled things carefully. piece by piece, and this time, he would not ignore the voice that had spoken when no one else dared. Jonathan Hale spent the night in his office on the 42nd floor of the hospital tower. He did not sleep. He did not pace. He sat at the long glass desk overlooking the city, sleeves rolled up, jacket draped over the back of the chair, the glow of multiple screens reflecting in his tired eyes. Outside, traffic thinned, lights dimmed, and the city entered that quiet hour, known only to insomniacs and people with too much at stake. Grace's medical file lay open beside his laptop. No longer just paper, but data that could be traced, compared, audited. Jonathan logged into the internal systems with credentials only a handful of people possessed. He had insisted on retaining override access when he acquired the hospital network, a detail his advisors had once called paranoid. Tonight, it felt like foresight. He began with access logs. Every digital touch left a fingerprint. Who opened the file? When? From which terminal? Jonathan filtered the list down to the last 72 hours. Names appeared. Doctors, residents, lab technicians, all expected. Then two entries stood out. Dr. Marcus Reed, Dr. Alan Whitmore, both senior physicians. Both had signed off on Grace's diagnosis. Both had accessed her records minutes after the lab results were finalized, and again, just before Jonathan had been handed the physical file. Jonathan leaned back slowly. Coincidence was something people believed in when they didn't want to look deeper. He opened the lab database next, pulling raw results directly from the machines that processed Grace's blood work. Numbers populated the screen in long, clinical rows. He cross-referenced them with the printed reports in the folder. They did not match, not dramatically. Not enough to trigger alarms, but enough to alter a conclusion. A kidney marker lowered just enough to suggest systemic failure rather than acute reaction. An enzyme level adjusted to support the narrative of an unknown syndrome. Subtle. Intentional. Jonathan closed his eyes for a brief second, feeling something inside him harden. This wasn't sloppy. This was careful. He pulled up financial disclosures next, moving beyond medicine into territory he understood intimately. Compensation, outside consulting fees, vendor relationships. It took longer. Whoever had done this had not been careless with money. Then he found it. A shell consulting firm with no physical address and a deliberately vague name. Modest monthly payments routed through layered accounts. Not enough to raise suspicion on their own. But when Jonathan overlaid the timeline, the payments began 3 weeks before Grace was admitted. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. Why? He thought of the failed takeover bid. The board vote that had nearly cost him control. The investors who had smiled while warning him that hospitals were not hotels, that healthcare required different leadership. Different leadership. Jonathan straightened. His phone buzzed softly. A message from ICU. Grace stable. No improvement. No decline. Stable. The word again. This time it sounded like borrowed time. He stood and walked to the window, pressing his palm against the cool glass. Somewhere below, people slept, ate late dinners, argued over nothing. Somewhere, Annie and her mother were probably finishing a shift that paid too little and demanded too much. And somewhere inside his own hospital, two men had decided his daughter was collateral. Jonathan returned to the desk and opened a new secure file. Investigation. He did not label it with Grace's name. He labeled it internal breach. At dawn, he went back to the ICU. Morning light filtered in softly, turning the sterile white of the room a pale gold. Grace looked unchanged, fragile but still fighting in her own quiet way. Jonathan sat beside her, taking her hand gently. "I'm here," he murmured, "and I'm not going anywhere." A nurse entered with morning updates. Jonathan listened, asked measured questions, said nothing about what he knew. He waited. By mid-morning, he summoned Dr. Reed. The doctor entered confidently, offering a professional nod. "Mr. Hale, I heard you had concerns." Jonathan gestured to the chair. "Sit." Dr. Reed hesitated, then complied. "I reviewed the labs again last night," Jonathan said calmly. "I noticed some discrepancies." Dr. Reed frowned. "Discrepancies?" Jonathan slid a tablet across the desk, displaying side-by-side comparisons. "These values, the originals and the reports you signed." Dr. Reed leaned forward, eyes narrowing. That's within acceptable variance. Jonathan watched his face closely. Variance usually doesn't involve rewritten notations. A pause, barely a second too long. Medical interpretation can differ, Dr. Reed said, especially in complex cases. Jonathan nodded slowly. You accessed the file 3 times yesterday. Dr. Reed stiffened. I was monitoring. And you received outside consulting payments from a firm with no address, Jonathan continued, his tone unchanged. Silence fell heavy between them. Dr. Reed leaned back. Mr. Hale, I think you're letting emotion cloud. This conversation is over, Jonathan said. For now. Dr. Reed opened his mouth to protest, then thought better of it. He stood and left without another word. Jonathan did not confront Dr. Whitmore that day. He did not alert administration. He did not act publicly. He understood predators well enough to know that the moment they sensed danger, they scattered. Instead, he prepared. That afternoon, he requested an independent lab rerun Grace's tests under anonymized identifiers. No names, no hospital affiliation, no opportunity for interference. He also requested security footage from the corridor outside the lab with the blue door. Late that evening, as the hospital settled into another long night, Jonathan reviewed the footage. There it was, 2 doctors entering, papers in hand, one removing a page, another writing quickly, whispering, a small figure lingering at the edge of the frame, half hidden behind a cart. Annie, Jonathan exhaled slowly. By the time he returned to Grace's room, his grief had transformed into resolve. They had underestimated him, and they had underestimated a child who had nothing to gain from lying. Jonathan stood at the foot of Grace's bed, the quiet hum of machines filling the room once more. This ends, he said softly. Not to the room, not to the hospital, but to the unseen people who thought they were untouchable. Outside, the city lights blinked on again, and somewhere deep inside the system Jonathan Hale owned, the first cracks had already begun to spread. Grace's condition had not improved, but the independent lab results arrived just after noon, encrypted and direct. Jonathan stood alone in his office when he opened the file, his heart steady in a way that surprised him. The diagnosis was different, not multi-organ failure of unknown origin, acute toxic suppression, reversible, treatable, dangerous but not hopeless. Jonathan closed his eyes, a long breath leaving his chest. Relief surged first, sharp and overwhelming, followed immediately by something darker. Someone had been killing his daughter slowly and calling it medicine. He printed the report and locked it in his personal safe. Then he sat down and did something he had not done since the early days of building his empire. He made a list. At the top, motive. The hospital acquisition had cost powerful people money, influence, control. Jonathan had forced out legacy boards, restructured leadership, and refused to sell controlling shares to private equity firms that treated healthcare like a numbers game. They had smiled. They had shaken his hand. They had waited. At the bottom of the list, access. Doctors Reed and Whitmore were not architects of a conspiracy. They were instruments, paid hands, cowards who hid behind white coats and plausible deniability, which meant someone else was pulling the strings. Jonathan stood and went to the ICU. Grace's room was quieter than usual, the afternoon lull settling in. Annie's mother was there, mopping near the far wall. Annie sat on a chair too big for her, legs swinging, watching the machines with a seriousness that didn't belong to 6-year-olds. Jonathan paused at the door. Children noticed things adults ignored. That was no longer a theory to him. It was fact. He walked in. Annie looked up first. Their eyes met. She didn't smile. You came back, she said. Yes, Jonathan replied. I said I would. Her mother straightened immediately. Mr. Hale, I can take her. No, Jonathan said gently. Please stay. He pulled a chair closer to Annie, careful not to invade her space. Annie, he said. Do you remember anything else from that day? She frowned, thinking. They were in a hurry. Who? The doctors, she said, but they kept looking at their phones. Jonathan leaned forward slightly. Did you see the phone? She nodded. One of them had a red case. It kept buzzing. Jonathan felt a quiet click in his mind. Did you hear anything they said? Annie hesitated. One said, If he finds out, we're done. Her mother inhaled sharply. Jonathan nodded slowly. You did very well, he said. You helped more than you know. Annie tilted her head. Is your daughter going to wake up? Jonathan swallowed.
Will she wake up?
I believe she will. 212. That night, Jonathan authorized a silent internal investigation through an external compliance firm with no ties to the hospital network. No announcements, no memos, just data, pulled quietly, methodically. Meanwhile, he made a decision that terrified the ICU team. He transferred Grace to a private wing under a different attending physician, one who had not touched her file before, and answered directly to Jonathan. The reaction was immediate. Dr. Whitmore confronted him in the corridor. You can't just override medical authority because you're emotional. Jonathan stopped walking. I'm not emotional, he said evenly. I'm informed. Whitmore's face paled. You're making a mistake. Jonathan leaned closer. No, he said softly. You did. Within hours, Reed and Whitmore were placed on administrative leave pending review. Officially, it was routine. Unofficially, panic rippled through the staff like an electric current. That evening, Jonathan received a call he had been expecting. A blocked number. Jonathan, a smooth male voice said. Familiar, educated, confident. You're causing unnecessary disruption. Jonathan smiled without humor. Then stop doing unnecessary harm. A pause. You don't understand the consequences. I understand leverage, Jonathan replied. And you lost yours the moment a child spoke up. Another pause. Longer this time. You think this ends well? The voice asked. Jonathan glanced through the glass at Grace, then toward Annie, laughing softly at something her mother whispered. I think truth has a way of surfacing, he said, especially when people underestimate who's watching. The line went dead. The next morning, Grace's treatment changed. Within 12 hours, her vitals stabilized. By evening, her fever broke. Jonathan sat beside her bed, exhaustion finally catching up to him. He thought of his wife, of the promise he had made years ago at a different hospital bed, that he would never again trust systems blindly. Annie peeked in from the doorway. She looks better, she said. Yes, Jonathan replied. Because of you, she shrugged. I just told the truth. Jonathan nodded. That's rarer than it should be. Outside the room, arrests were not made. Names were not yet released. This was not a spectacle. It was a reckoning in motion, and Jonathan Hale had no intention of stopping halfway. Jonathan Hale woke before dawn on the narrow couch beside Grace's bed, his body stiff, his mind already moving. The monitors told him what he needed to know before the nurse spoke. Grace's breathing was steadier. Her color, still pale, had warmth again. The treatment change was working. It should have worked days ago. He stood slowly, careful not to disturb her, and walked to the window. The hospital grounds below were quiet, washed in the muted blue of early morning. For most people, this hour belonged to peace. For Jonathan, it belonged to memory. He remembered another dawn, 4 years earlier, another hospital room, another machine breathing for someone he loved. Back then, he had trusted the doctors. Back then, he had believed that authority meant protection. He would never make that mistake again. A soft knock came at the door. Jonathan turned as Dr. Elaine Porter stepped in. She was in her early 50s, calm-eyed, silver-threaded through her dark hair. Jonathan had brought her in quietly from a teaching hospital 3 states away. She had no ties to his network, no favors owed. She responded well overnight, Dr. Porter said. That confirms the toxic suppression theory. Jonathan nodded. How long before we know for sure? 48 hours, she replied. But I'm confident. Confident. The word carried weight when it wasn't used defensively. Jonathan exhaled. Thank you for telling me the truth. Dr. Porter met his gaze. Truth shouldn't be rare in medicine. No, Jonathan said, but it's often inconvenient. After she left, Jonathan checked his phone. 3 missed calls, 1 voicemail, unknown number. He listened once. Mr. Hale, the voice said smoothly, controlled, unmistakably practiced. We need to discuss a resolution before things escalate further. For your daughter's sake. Jonathan deleted the message. Threats framed as concern were still threats. He left the ICU an hour later, moving with purpose. The hospital felt different now. Staff watched him more closely. Conversations stopped when he passed. The illusion of normalcy had cracked. Good. In a quiet conference room on the administrative floor, Jonathan met with the compliance firm he had hired. 2 men and 1 woman sat across from him. Files open, expressions grave. We've identified irregular financial patterns, the lead investigator said. Payments routed through multiple intermediaries to Reed and Whitmore. As expected, Jonathan leaned forward. From whom? The woman slid a folder across the table. A private investment group operating under several subsidiaries. Their interest aligns with the failed acquisition attempt last quarter. Jonathan opened the folder. The names meant nothing at first glance. Then one did. He felt it land in his chest, heavy and unmistakable. So, he said quietly, they couldn't buy the hospital. No, the investigator replied. But they could destabilize its leadership. Jonathan closed the folder. By targeting my child, the room went silent. That wasn't necessarily the original intent, the man said carefully. But leverage escalates. Jonathan stood. It ends now. He authorized the next phase without hesitation. By noon, federal regulators were quietly notified. Not through public channels, through personal calls, through favors earned long before this crisis. Jonathan did not want headlines yet. He wanted control. That afternoon, Annie and her mother were reassigned temporarily to lighter duties in a different wing. Officially, it was to reduce stress. Unofficially, it was protection. Jonathan found Annie in the hospital cafeteria, swinging her legs beneath the table while her mother drank coffee that had gone cold. Mr. Conant. Hail, her mother said quickly, standing. Please, Jonathan said. Sit. Annie looked up at him.
Hey buddy, it's Dad.
Did I get in trouble? No, Jonathan said immediately. You did something very important. She studied his face. Grown-ups don't like it when kids tell the truth. Jonathan smiled faintly. That's because truth changes things. She considered this, then nodded as if filing it away for later. I want you to know something, Jonathan continued. What you did helped save my daughter, said, and Annie's eyes widened. Really? Yes. She smiled then, small and shy. I just didn't like how they were whispering. Jonathan felt something tighten behind his ribs. Sometimes that's enough. As he turned to leave, her mother spoke quietly. Thank you for seeing her. Most people don't. Jonathan paused. I didn't see her soon enough, he said. But I won't make that mistake again. Olded. That evening, as Grace slept peacefully for the first time since admission, Jonathan received confirmation that warrants were being prepared. Phones were being tapped. Emails traced. The machine had begun to move. Jonathan sat beside Grace, holding her hand, feeling the warmth there, real and undeniable. He leaned close. I'm sorry, he whispered. I trusted the wrong people. Grace stirred slightly, her fingers curling weakly around his. Jonathan stayed like that for a long time. The hospital quiet around him, the future uncertain but no longer out of reach. Somewhere above them, powerful people were realizing that the man they had underestimated was no longer playing defense. And somewhere in the building, a little girl who mopped floors and noticed whispers had changed the course of a life far bigger than her own. Justice, Jonathan thought, was rarely loud, but it was relentless. Jonathan Hale learned very quickly who stopped answering his calls. By the morning of the 6th day, the silence itself had become a map. Board members who once prided themselves on immediate responsiveness now sent assistance. Legal advisors suddenly needed more time. A senior executive who had dined at Jonathan's home twice last year claimed to be out of the country. Fear rearranged loyalties faster than any contract ever could. Jonathan stood in the private observation room overlooking the ICU, hands resting on the glass railing. Grace was awake now, not fully alert, but conscious. Her eyes followed movement. Her breathing no longer relied entirely on machines. Progress, real progress. Dr. Porter stood beside him, reviewing charts on a tablet. Her markers continue to normalize, she said. If this trend holds, we can begin reducing support tomorrow. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly. You're certain the cause was introduced externally? Yes, Dr. Porter replied without hesitation, and deliberately. Jonathan nodded. He had stopped asking why medicine failed. He was asking who benefited. Keep everything documented, he said. Every change, every improvement. Dr. Porter met his gaze. You're building a case. I'm finishing one, Jonathan corrected. Later that morning, the first move against him came. The call arrived from his legal counsel, voice tight. Jonathan, a complaint has been filed with the State Medical Board, alleging undue influence, abuse of ownership authority. They're claiming you interfered with medical judgment. Jonathan smiled faintly. That didn't take long. This could get ugly, the lawyer warned. They're positioning you as an overreaching billionaire intimidating doctors. Good, Jonathan said. That means they're scared. He ended the call and turned to the window again. Below, an ambulance pulled in. Routine, urgent, indifferent to power struggles. Hospitals were full of stories. Most never reached daylight. That afternoon, Jonathan requested a private meeting with the hospital's interim ethics committee. Not to plead, to observe. He arrived alone. No attorneys, no aides. The room fell quiet as he entered. You wanted to address concerns. The committee chair began carefully. Jonathan nodded. I wanted to understand how ethics are applied when a child's life is at stake. The chair cleared his throat. This isn't about a single patient. It is, Jonathan replied calmly. It's about whether ethics protect the vulnerable or the comfortable. Silence. Jonathan placed a single document on the table. Independent lab results, he said. Unaltered, demonstrating a treatable condition. The committee members leaned forward. And this, Jonathan continued, sliding another document across, is video evidence of two physicians altering lab reports. A sharp intake of breath from someone at the far end. Jonathan folded his hands. Now tell me, he said quietly, how ethical it would have been for me not to intervene. No one answered. That evening, the story shifted. Not publicly. Not yet. But inside the building, doors closed. Emails were recalled. Files were locked. Jonathan walked the halls unnoticed, observing. He had learned long ago that power revealed itself most clearly when it thought it was unseen. In the pediatric wing, he found Annie sitting on the floor with a box of crayons, coloring quietly while her mother spoke with a supervisor nearby. Annie looked up and grinned. Your daughter waved at me today. Jonathan felt something warm and sharp in his chest. She did? Yeah, Annie said. She's getting better. Jonathan knelt beside her. She is. And you helped that happen. Annie shrugged, then frowned. Are the bad doctors mad at you? Jonathan considered the question carefully. Some people don't like it when the truth costs them something. She nodded slowly. That happens at the shelter too. Jonathan straightened, the weight of that statement settling in. It shouldn't, he said. That night, the second move came. A board vote was called. Emergency session. Agenda item. Temporary suspension of Jonathan Hale's executive authority pending investigation. Jonathan listened to the notification without reaction. They were trying to isolate him. He allowed it to proceed. The next morning, as the board convened, federal agents arrived quietly at the hospital. Not in uniform. No spectacle. Just badges flashed in private offices. Dr. Reed was escorted out first. Pale, silent. Dr. Whitmore followed an hour later. Phones began ringing across the executive floor. By the time the board vote concluded, narrowly approving temporary suspension news reached the room. Federal investigation, evidence of medical fraud, potential criminal charges. The vote meant nothing now. Jonathan received the update in Grace's room, his phone vibrating softly in his hand. He didn't answer it immediately. Grace's eyes fluttered open. Daddy, she whispered. Jonathan leaned forward instantly. I'm here. Was 9. She frowned slightly. Did I sleep too long? He smiled, tears threatening for the first time in days. You're allowed to. She squeezed his finger weakly. The room feels quieter. Jonathan glanced at the machines, then back at her. It is. Outside the room, Annie pressed her palm to the glass, watching. Jonathan caught her eye and nodded once. She nodded back, solemn and proud. Later that afternoon, Jonathan finally returned the call from his lawyer. They're pulling back, the the lawyer said breathlessly. The board's reversing course. They didn't know about the federal angle. They never do, Jonathan replied. Jonathan, the lawyer added, this could get very public. Jonathan looked at Grace, then at Annie, laughing softly with a nurse. Let it, he said. Some stories need light. That night, as the hospital settled, Jonathan stood alone on the terrace outside his office. The city stretched endlessly before him, full of people who believed systems worked as advertised. He had believed that once. Now he knew better. Justice wasn't about position or wealth. Sometimes, it began with a child who refused to stay quiet. It felt like a place holding its breath. Jonathan Hale stood at the glass wall outside Grace's room, coffee cooling untouched in his hand. Overnight, she had spoken in full sentences. Not many, not strong, but real. Each word had felt like a quiet miracle, the kind that didn't announce itself but rewrote everything all the same. Dr. Porter emerged from the room, closing the door softly behind her. She's improving faster than expected, she said. Her organs are recovering now that the toxin is clearing her system. Jonathan nodded. How long before she can leave the ICU? If there are no setbacks, Dr. Porter replied. 2 days, maybe 3. Jonathan exhaled, a breath he felt he had been holding for weeks. Thank you. Dr. Porter studied him for a moment. You should prepare yourself, she added. Recovery will take time. Physically, emotionally. I know, Jonathan said. I'll be here. Oops, that was the one promise he no longer made lightly. As the day progressed, the consequences of truth rippled outward. News leaked, despite careful containment. Not names yet, not details, but enough to stir the water. Staff whispered. Phones buzzed. A sense of reckoning settled into the building like a storm cloud that no one could ignore. Jonathan received an invitation he had anticipated and dreaded in equal measure. A request from the district attorney's office. He accepted without hesitation. The meeting took place in a quiet government building across town. All beige walls and neutral expressions. Jonathan arrived alone, declining legal counsel for now. He had learned that truth carried more weight when spoken plainly. The prosecutor, a woman in her late 40s with tired eyes and a voice sharpened by experience, reviewed documents as Jonathan sat across from her. We have sufficient evidence to proceed, she said finally. Medical fraud, conspiracy, reckless endangerment. Jonathan nodded. And the people behind them? She met his gaze. We're working our way up. Good, Jonathan said, because the doctors weren't the point. She studied him carefully. You understand this will get public. Yes, and ugly. Yes, and personal. Jonathan's voice did not change. It already is. She closed the file. There's something else, she said. The defense will argue you used your position to manipulate outcomes, that you interfered. Jonathan leaned back slightly. I interfered with a lie. That may not matter in public opinion, she warned. Jonathan thought of Annie, of her quiet certainty, of the way she had spoken when no one else would. Public opinion changes, he said. Truth doesn't. When he returned to the hospital, evening had settled in. The lights were softer now, the hallways quieter. In the pediatric wing, Jonathan found Grace sitting up for the first time, pillows stacked behind her, a small stuffed bear resting in her lap. Daddy, she said, her voice still thin but unmistakably hers. They said I can have applesauce. Jonathan smiled, emotion catching him off guard. That's excellent news. He sat beside her, brushing her hair back gently. How do you feel? She considered the question seriously. Tired, she said, but not scary tired anymore. Jonathan closed his eyes for a brief second. That's the best kind of tired. A soft knock came at the door. Annie stood there with her mother, hesitant as ever. Annie held a piece of folded paper in both hands. I made something, she said. Jonathan gestured them in. You can give it to her. Annie approached Grace carefully, unfolding the paper to reveal a crayon drawing. 2 girls holding hands. A sun overhead. A hospital building behind them. This is you, Annie said, pointing. And this is me. Grace smiled faintly. You're my friend now, she said, stating it as fact. Annie's face lit up. Okay, Jonathan watched them, something heavy loosening in his chest. This small, ordinary connection felt like the most extraordinary outcome of all. Later that night, Jonathan sat alone in his office again. City lights spread beneath him like a restless sea. His phone rang. This time, the number was not blocked. "Jonathan," came a familiar voice. Controlled, measured. "You've made your point." Jonathan did not respond immediately. "There are ways to resolve this quietly," the voice continued. "Settlements,
Your chart looks good.
donations,
Everything is stable.
statements of regret." Jonathan leaned back, gaze fixed on the dark glass. "You don't regret what you did," he said. "You regret getting caught." A pause. "You're risking your reputation," the voice said. "Your company." Jonathan thought of Grace's fingers curling around his, of Annie's drawing, of a child's voice saying, "They changed them." "I already lost the thing that mattered most once," Jonathan replied. "I won't bargain with what's left." The line went dead. Jonathan set the phone down. For the first time, he felt no fear about what came next. Because this was no longer just about exposing corruption or reclaiming control. It was about setting a boundary so clear that no one would dare cross it again. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the quiet line that had been drawn. Inside the hospital, a little girl slept peacefully for the first time in days, and a man who had built everything once more understood what he was truly meant to protect. It tapped softly against the tall windows of the pediatric wing, a steady, patient sound that matched the mood of the hospital. Nothing rushed anymore. Nothing panicked. The crisis had shifted from survival to consequence, and everyone could feel it. Jonathan Hale watched the rain from the chair beside Grace's bed. She was awake, alert enough to complain about the bland breakfast tray and negotiate for cartoons. To anyone else, it would have seemed ordinary. To Jonathan, it felt like resurrection. "Daddy," Grace said suddenly, her eyes fixed on the window. "Is it going to rain all day?" "Probably," Jonathan replied. "Some days need it." She nodded, accepting that answer more easily than most adults ever would. Dr. Porter entered a few minutes later with quiet confidence. "We're moving her out of the ICU this afternoon," she said. "Step-down unit. She's strong enough." Jonathan stood slowly. "Thank you, Doctor." Porter hesitated, then added, "There will be questions. Media, boards, lawyers." Jonathan met her gaze. "I'm ready." She gave a small, approving nod and left. Word traveled fast. By mid-morning, staff lined the hallway discreetly as Grace was transferred. Nurses smiled openly now. Some touched Jonathan's shoulder in passing, small gestures of solidarity they hadn't dared offer before. Others avoided his eyes. Fear still lived here, but it was changing shape. In the step-down unit, the room felt warmer, less mechanical, fewer machines, more light. Grace took it all in with quiet curiosity. "Can Annie come see me?" she asked. Jonathan paused. "If she wants to." "I want her to," Grace said simply. Jonathan smiled. "Then she will." Annie arrived that afternoon, escorted carefully by her mother. She stepped into the room slowly, eyes wide, taking in the softer bed, the stuffed animals someone had already brought, the way Grace sat up on her own. "You look different," Annie said. "Better," Grace replied. "You're the girl who tells the truth." Annie considered this. "Yeah," she said. "I guess I am." They sat together on the bed, coloring quietly, two children connected by something neither fully understood. Jonathan watched them, feeling the weight of the past week settle into something steadier. Outside the room, his phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a threat. It was an invitation. A national news network requesting an exclusive interview. Jonathan stared at the screen for a long moment, then declined. Instead, he dialed another number. The call connected quickly. "Mr. Hale," the voice on the other end said. "We were wondering when we'd hear from you." "You're going to," Jonathan replied. "On my terms." That evening, the first official charges were announced. Carefully worded, limited scope. Enough to satisfy the public's appetite without revealing the full rot beneath the surface. Jonathan read the statement alone in his office. Medical fraud, conspiracy, breach of trust. No mention yet of the investors. No mention of attempted coercion. That would come later. He closed the document and leaned back, rubbing his temples. For the first time, exhaustion caught up with him fully. Not physical, something deeper. The kind that came from holding a line too long. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Annie's mother stood in the doorway, hesitant. "Mr. Hale?" "Yes?" "She wanted to give you this," the woman said, holding out a folded piece of paper. Jonathan took it carefully. Inside was another drawing. This one showed a tall building, a small house, and 3 figures standing between them. One tall, 2 small. Underneath, in uneven letters, were the words, "Thank you for listening." Jonathan swallowed hard. "Please tell her," he said quietly, "that I heard her." Later that night, after Grace had fallen asleep, Jonathan stood alone on the hospital terrace again. The rain had stopped. The city lights shimmered on wet pavement below. He thought of his wife, of how fiercely she had believed in doing the right thing even when it cost more than it gained. He had loved that about her. Feared it, too. Now he understood it. Power, he realized, wasn't about control. It was about responsibility. His phone rang once more. This time, he answered. "We need to talk," the voice said, stripped now of confidence. Jonathan looked out over the city. "We will," he replied. In daylight, the line disconnected. Jonathan remained where he was, the wind cool against his face, the future uncertain but no longer threatening. Inside the hospital, 2 little girls slept peacefully, and for the first time in a very long while, Jonathan Hale believed that maybe, just maybe, the truth could still win. It began with voices. Jonathan Hale woke to the low murmur of tension outside Grace's room, the kind that carried urgency without panic. He sat up instantly, instinct sharpened by days of vigilance. For a fraction of a second, fear surged. Then he saw Grace sleeping peacefully, her chest rising and falling in a calm, steady rhythm. Not her. He stepped into the hallway. 2 hospital administrators stood near the nurses' station, faces tight, voices lowered but urgent. A security officer hovered nearby, pretending not to listen. "Mr. Hale," one of the administrators said as soon as he saw him. "We've been contacted by the board." Jonathan folded his arms. "I assumed you would be. They're requesting an emergency meeting." The man continued. "Today, in person." Jonathan nodded once. "Good." The administrator hesitated. "They're also concerned about media presence. There are reporters outside." Jonathan glanced toward the windows at the end of the corridor. Camera vans, satellite dishes, movement. So it had begun. "Let them wait," Jonathan said calmly. "My daughter comes first." He returned to Grace's room and sat beside her bed, taking her hand gently. Her fingers curled instinctively around his. "Daddy?" she murmured, half asleep. "I'm here," he said softly. "Go back to sleep." She did. Jonathan stayed until her breathing deepened again. Only then did he stand. The board meeting took place in a private conference room on the top floor, one Jonathan had once chosen for its view. Today, the skyline looked distant, unreal. 7 board members sat around the table. Some avoided his gaze. Others watched him too closely. "Jonathan," the chair began, attempting familiarity. "Thank you for coming." Jonathan took a seat without replying. "We need to address the situation," the chair continued. "Public confidence is at risk. Investors are nervous. There are questions about governance." Jonathan leaned back slightly. "There are questions about attempted murder," he said evenly. "Let's not confuse the two." A ripple of discomfort moved through the room. "This language is inflammatory," one member said sharply. "So is falsifying medical records," Jonathan replied. "So is poisoning a child." Silence. The chair cleared his throat. "The board is prepared to offer a path forward." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." 18. "We believe a temporary step back from public-facing leadership might calm the situation," the chair said. "A leave of absence. Quiet. Dignified." Jonathan almost smiled. "You want me to disappear," he said, "so the story can be managed." "That's not fair." "It's accurate," Jonathan interrupted. "And no," a woman at the far end leaned forward. "Jonathan, this isn't just about you. It's about the institution." Jonathan met her gaze. "Then act like it."
Okay.
Cooperate fully. Open every file. Release every name. No shielding, no settlements. That could destroy careers. Another member protested. Jonathan's voice hardened. It almost destroyed my daughter. The chair exhaled slowly. If you push this, there will be consequences. Jonathan stood. There already are. He left without another word. Outside, the press surged the moment he stepped into view. Microphones, cameras, questions fired like bullets. Mr. Hale, is it true your influence compromised medical care? Are you using your wealth to intimidate doctors? Jonathan stopped. The noise faded as reporters realized he was about to speak. My daughter was poisoned, Jonathan said calmly. That fact doesn't change based on who owns the building. A hush fell. I will not be silent so others can remain comfortable, he continued. If that unsettles you, ask why. He turned and walked back inside. That evening, Grace asked to sit by the window. Jonathan helped her carefully, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. The city glowed below, restless and alive. Why are there so many people outside? She asked. Jonathan considered the question. Because sometimes, he said, truth makes noise. She nodded, satisfied. A knock came at the door. Annie peeked in, then stepped inside with her mother close behind. She held a small paper bag. I brought cookies, Annie announced. The nurse said it was okay. Grace smiled. You're my hero, she said solemnly. Annie's cheeks flushed. I just talked. Jonathan watched them, something deep inside him settling into place. Later, after the girls had fallen asleep, Jonathan sat alone with his phone. A new message blinked on the screen, from a number he now recognized. We need to meet. Tonight, before this gets worse. Jonathan typed a single reply. Tomorrow. With lawyers and prosecutors. He set the phone down. Outside, the city buzzed with speculation and outrage. Inside the hospital, something quieter but more powerful was taking shape. Accountability. Jonathan stood and looked once more at Grace. At the life returning to her. At the fragile miracle no system had the right to gamble with. He knew the next days would be harder, but he also knew this. The truth had survived its most dangerous moment, and now it was walking into the light. Jonathan Hale was in Grace's room, helping her finish a bowl of oatmeal she insisted tasted better with honey. When his phone vibrated quietly on the bedside table, he glanced at the screen once, then set it face down without answering. Grace noticed anyway. Is that another grown-up problem? She asked. Jonathan smiled faintly. Yes, but it can wait 5 minutes. She nodded solemnly, as if granting permission, and took another careful bite. By the time he stepped into the hallway, the message had already been followed by 2 more. This one carried a different weight. Not threats, not negotiations. A formal notice. The district attorney's office requested his presence that afternoon, along with representatives from the hospital board and legal counsel for the investment group now under investigation. Everything was converging. Jonathan exhaled slowly and made his way down the corridor. The hospital felt alert today, like a body sensing change. Nurses spoke in lower voices. Security stood straighter. Somewhere deep in the building, people were erasing things they should have erased weeks ago. Too late. Before leaving, Jonathan stopped by the small family lounge near the pediatric wing. Annie sat on the floor, lining up toy cars with careful precision, while her mother filled out paperwork at a nearby table. Mr. Hale, her mother said, standing quickly. Jonathan raised a hand. Please, don't. He crouched slightly. Annie, he said, I'm going to be gone for a little while today. She looked up. Are you going to the place where grown-ups lie? Jonathan blinked, caught off guard. Sometimes, he said honestly. But today, I'm going to a place where they have to answer. She considered this, then nodded. Okay, he straightened and turned to her mother. Security will walk you both to and from your shifts, he said quietly. That's not a request. The woman's eyes filled with worry. Is something wrong? Something is ending, Jonathan replied. And endings can make people careless. She nodded, understanding more than she wanted to. The meeting took place in a federal building that smelled faintly of old paper and disinfectant. Jonathan arrived early. He always did. He had learned long ago that arriving early wasn't about control, it was about observation. The others filed in one by one. The board chair, pale and rigid. Two lawyers from the investment group, faces carefully neutral. A representative from the hospital's legal team, avoiding Jonathan's gaze. And finally, the prosecutor, calm and watchful. No pleasantries were exchanged. "Let's begin," the prosecutor said. Documents were placed on the table. Financial trails, email transcripts, video stills from security footage, timelines laid out with brutal clarity. The truth, when organized properly, did not need embellishment. "This is what we have," the prosecutor continued. "And this is what we believe we can prove." One of the lawyers cleared his throat. There were no explicit orders to harm anyone. Jonathan leaned forward slightly. "There never are," he said. "That's the point." The lawyer bristled. "You're not on the prosecution team, Mr. Hale." "No," Jonathan replied evenly. "I'm the reason you're sitting here." "IDs stand." The prosecutor raised a hand, not to silence him, but to acknowledge the truth of it. "What happened to your daughter," she said, "was the result of a coordinated effort to destabilize leadership through personal leverage." The board chair flinched. "We have evidence," the prosecutor continued, "that certain investors believed a public medical tragedy would weaken Mr. Hale's position enough to force a sale." The room went very still. "You used a child," Jonathan said quietly, his voice steady in a way that frightened even him. One of the lawyers shifted uncomfortably. "We did not anticipate." "You anticipated fear," Jonathan interrupted. "You anticipated grief. You just didn't anticipate resistance." Silence. The meeting lasted 3 hours. When it ended, there were no handshakes, no assurances, only a clear understanding that nothing could be undone. Outside, Jonathan paused on the steps of the building, breathing in air that felt heavier than before. Accountability was never clean. It dragged everything into the open. His phone buzzed. "Grace," he answered immediately. "Daddy," she said. "Annie taught me how to draw hearts." Jonathan smiled despite himself. "Did she?" "Yes," Grace continued. "She says hearts are easier when you don't try too hard." Jonathan closed his eyes briefly. "She's very wise." And when he returned to the hospital that evening, the atmosphere had shifted again. This time, it was quieter, resigned, like a storm that had passed and left debris behind. Grace sat up in bed, coloring enthusiastically. "You look tired," she said. "I am," Jonathan admitted, "but it's a good tired." Annie sat beside her, tongue peeking out slightly as she concentrated. She looked up when Jonathan entered. "Did you win?" she asked. Jonathan considered the question carefully. "No," he said, "but neither did the people who tried to hurt her." Annie nodded, satisfied. That night, after the girls were asleep, Jonathan stood alone by the window again. The city lights shimmered. Indifferent as ever, he thought of how close he had come to losing everything that mattered, not because of fate, but because of calculation. Power, he understood now, wasn't dangerous on its own. It was dangerous when it forgot who it was supposed to serve. Jonathan picked up his phone and drafted a single message to his legal team. "Proceed. No settlements. Full cooperation." He sent it without hesitation. For the first time since this began, he felt something close to peace. Not relief, resolution. No reporters, no urgent calls, no new revelations breaking through the noise. Just a quiet morning sun slipping through the windows of the step-down unit, touching the pale walls and the small bed where Grace now slept without machines. Jonathan Hale sat beside her, reading emails he no longer trusted and memos he no longer feared. Silence, he had learned, was not always peace. Sometimes it was the pause before consequences finished landing. Grace stirred and opened her eyes. "Daddy," she said, voice stronger now. "I dreamed Mommy was singing." Jonathan felt the familiar ache rise, sharp and sudden. He reached out and brushed her hair back gently. What was she singing? Grace thought. The one about stars. Jonathan smiled softly.
For everything.
His wife used to hum that song when Grace wouldn't sleep, standing by the crib long after exhaustion should have won. "She sings when you're brave," Jonathan said quietly. Grace nodded, as if that made perfect sense. Later that morning, Dr. Porter confirmed what Jonathan had been hoping for but refusing to assume. She can go home in 48 hours, she said, with monitoring, physical therapy. But she's past the danger. Jonathan closed his eyes, not in relief, but in gratitude so deep it almost frightened him. Thank you, he said, again, for the 100th time. And this time, it felt inadequate. When Dr. Porter left, Jonathan stayed seated, watching Grace color with deliberate care. Outside the room, the hospital moved forward, but something had shifted permanently. People made eye contact now. Some smiled, others looked away. Truth had a way of rearranging hierarchies. By midday, the first internal resignations came through. Quiet emails, carefully worded statements citing personal reasons and family priorities. Jonathan read them without satisfaction. Accountability wasn't about humiliation, it was about removal. He forwarded every resignation to the prosecutor's office with a single note. Do not confuse exit with absolution. That afternoon, Annie came running down the hall, shoes squeaking, laughter trailing behind her before her mother could hush her. Grace looked up immediately. You're fast today, Grace said. Annie grinned. I practiced. Jonathan watched them together, the easy way they now occupied the same space. He thought of how close this had come to never existing at all. Mr. Fide, hail, Annie's mother said hesitantly, approaching him. They told me my contract's been extended, Jonathan nodded. Good, and they said Annie can start school early next term, she added, disbelief still present in her voice. With support, Jonathan met her eyes. She's ready. The woman swallowed hard. Thank you. Jonathan shook his head. She earned it. That evening, Jonathan received a message he had been waiting for. Charges expanded. Additional warrants approved. Financial records unsealed. The machine was no longer grinding slowly. It was moving with purpose now, and with movement came backlash. A late-night opinion piece framed him as a dangerous precedent, a billionaire who blurred lines, a man whose personal tragedy had destabilized an institution. Jonathan read it once, then closed it. They always tried to rewrite the story when the truth made them uncomfortable. He didn't need to respond. Grace asked him to read to her that night. He chose a book his wife used to love, one about a small lighthouse that refused to turn off its light during a storm. Why didn't it stop? Grace asked sleepily. Jonathan smiled. Because someone might need it. When she fell asleep, Jonathan stepped into the hallway and found Annie sitting on a bench, feet dangling, staring at the floor. Everything okay? He asked. She looked up. My mom says people are mad. Hi. Some are, Jonathan replied honestly. Did I do something wrong? Annie asked, voice quiet now. Jonathan crouched to her level. No, he said firmly. You did something right when it was hard. That's what scares people. She thought about this. Okay. He watched her run back to her mother, and something inside him settled. Later that night, alone in his office, Jonathan reviewed a single old file he hadn't opened in years. His wife's medical records. He had avoided them out of fear that looking too closely would reveal something he couldn't bear. Now, with painful clarity, he wondered. He didn't draw conclusions, but he asked questions. For the first time since her death, he allowed himself that. Outside, the city hummed as always. Inside, Jonathan Hale wrote a statement he had no intention of publishing yet. Not defensive, not polished, just the truth. Power does not excuse silence. We do not measure integrity by how quietly injustice is managed. If a child can see what adults refuse to name, then the failure is not innocence. It is courage. He saved the document and shut down the screen. Tomorrow would bring another wave, another response, another attempt to negotiate reality. But tonight, Grace slept peacefully. Annie laughed without fear. And Jonathan Hale finally understood that justice, when it came, was rarely loud. It was deliberate, and it did not ask permission. The storm arrived just after midnight, not the kind that announced itself with thunder and drama, but the slow, relentless kind, rain tapping at windows, wind pressing against glass as if testing for weakness. Jonathan Hale stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse, one hand resting on the cool surface, watching the city blur into streaks of light. Grace was home now, asleep in the next room, surrounded by stuffed animals, her breathing steady, her body still fragile but no longer slipping away from him. That alone should have been enough to quiet his mind. It wasn't, because the truth, once uncovered, never stopped where you wanted it to. Jonathan turned back to the table behind him. Spread across it were copies of internal emails, audit trails, and a timeline his legal team had assembled with brutal precision. The original manipulation of Grace's test results had not been an isolated act. It was a rehearsal. Patterns emerged when you stared long enough. Delayed diagnoses. Adjusted prognoses. Patients quietly transferred. Families persuaded to accept inevitable outcomes. And always, the same handful of names orbiting the decisions. Medicine hadn't failed. People had. His phone buzzed softly. A secure line. "Jonathan," said the voice of the federal investigator assigned to the case. "We confirmed something you should know before morning." Jonathan closed his eyes briefly. "Go ahead. The 2 doctors who altered your daughter's records didn't just take bribes," the investigator continued. "They were part of an internal advisory group. Informal. No paper trail. But they influenced treatment protocols across 3 hospitals you acquired in the last 4 years." Jonathan felt something cold settle in his chest. "How many patients?" he asked. There was a pause. A careful one. "We're still counting, but enough that this won't stay quiet." Jonathan ended the call without ceremony and sat down heavily. He thought of Grace, of her small body in that hospital bed, of Annie's voice, unafraid, cutting through a room full of trained professionals who had learned to look away. And he wondered how many other Annies had never been there. At 2 in the morning, Jonathan did something he hadn't done since his wife died. He poured himself a drink. He didn't touch it. Instead, he carried the glass into the room that had once belonged to his wife. It had remained untouched for 4 years, preserved like a museum exhibit of grief. Tonight, he turned on the lamp and sat at her desk. "I didn't see it," he said aloud, to no one and to her. "I should have." The next morning began with sirens, not outside his building, but on every screen. News alerts, breaking banners, carefully chosen words that still couldn't soften the impact. A federal investigation into systemic medical fraud. Whistleblower testimony. Internal sabotage tied to corporate power struggles. Jonathan Hale's name was everywhere. Some praised him. Others sharpened knives. By noon, protesters gathered outside the hospital network's flagship building. Some demanded justice. Others accused him of orchestrating chaos to consolidate power. Jonathan didn't attend the emergency board meeting. He sent a single message instead. "I am not stepping down. I am stepping in." At the hospital, tension thickened the air. Staff whispered. Security doubled. Administrators avoided eye contact. Annie sat on a bench near the pediatrics wing, swinging her legs, eating an apple her mother had sliced for her. She watched adults hurry past, their voices tight, their faces drawn. "They look scared," Annie said quietly. Her mother glanced around and lowered her voice. "Big changes scare people," Annie frowned. "But they were already doing bad things." Her mother didn't answer. She didn't know how. Later that afternoon, Jonathan arrived unannounced. Not with an entourage, not with cameras, just him. When he entered the ward, conversations stopped. Doctors froze mid-sentence. Nurses straightened. Jonathan walked past them all and knelt in front of Annie. "You did something very important," he said. Annie looked at him seriously. "Are people in trouble?" "Yes," Jonathan replied. "Because of what they chose. Not because of you." "Everyone," she nodded, satisfied with that. Jonathan stood and addressed the room. "I am not here to fire anyone today," he said evenly. "I'm here to listen. If you've seen something wrong, if you were told to stay quiet, if you were pressured, this is your moment." No one spoke. Then, slowly, a nurse stepped forward. Her hands trembled. "I was told not to log certain vitals," she said. "I didn't understand why." Another voice followed. "They moved my patient before I could escalate concerns." Esprevier. A third. "I was threatened with termination." The dam broke quietly. No shouting. No chaos. Just truth. One voice at a time. Jonathan listened. That night, he sat beside Grace's bed again. "Daddy," she asked softly, "are you mad?" He shook his head. "No, I'm awake." She smiled, already drifting off. In the hallway, Annie waited with her mother. Jonathan approached and handed the woman a folder. "This is a scholarship fund," he said. "For Annie. And for other children like her. It's not charity, it's investment." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "Why us?" Jonathan looked at Annie. "Because someone told the truth when it mattered." As he left the hospital, rain began to fall again. Jonathan Hale walked into it without an umbrella. For the first time in years, he wasn't trying to stay dry. The first subpoena arrived before sunrise. Jonathan Hale read it at the kitchen counter while the coffee cooled untouched beside him. The language was precise, almost polite, but the intent beneath it was unmistakable. This was no longer just about corrupt doctors or altered charts. This was about power. Grace padded into the kitchen in her socks, dragging her blanket behind her like a cape. She looked smaller at home than she had in the hospital, as if the walls themselves remembered how close they had come to losing her. "Is today a work day?" she asked. Jonathan knelt and wrapped his arms around her. "Today is a listening day." She accepted that answer easily. Children often did. After breakfast, he drove her to physical therapy himself. No driver, no security detail, just a quiet drive through streets he had once only seen from behind tinted glass. Grace watched raindrops race down the window, humming softly. At the clinic, an older man in the waiting room recognized him. Their eyes met. The man hesitated, then nodded once, not in deference, but acknowledgement. Jonathan returned it. He was learning the difference. By mid-morning, the counteroffensive began. A senior board member requested a private clarification meeting. A former ally released a statement expressing concern over destabilizing leadership. An anonymous source leaked that Jonathan had overstepped, blurred corporate governance with personal vendetta. Jonathan read every word. Then he shut his laptop. At the hospital, Annie sat with a box of crayons, coloring carefully within the lines. Her mother stood nearby, stiff with a kind of tension that had nothing to do with work. "They asked me questions," her mother said quietly when Jonathan approached. "Human resources. Legal. They were polite, but you felt watched," Jonathan finished. She nodded. "You did nothing wrong," Jonathan said. "And you won't be punished for telling the truth. I promise." She studied his face, measuring the weight of that promise. "People like us don't usually get promises kept." Jonathan didn't argue. He simply said, "I intend to be unusual." That afternoon, the first arrest was made. One of the doctors, not the worst of them, but the first to break. News crews swarmed the entrance. Protesters multiplied. The story fractured into opinions and counterclaims. Jonathan stayed inside. In a conference room on the 6th floor, he met with investigators, regulators, and an ethics panel that had not existed a week earlier. The discussion was tense, methodical, relentless. "How did this go unnoticed?" one woman asked. Jonathan answered without hesitation. "Because success made us complacent. Because outcomes mattered more than process. Because no one believed a system that saved lives could also quietly destroy them." No one contradicted him. That evening, Jonathan found Annie alone in the hallway, staring at a plaque mounted near the elevators. "What does it say?" she asked. Jonathan read it aloud. "In recognition of exemplary service and integrity." She frowned. "Why do they need to remind people?" Jonathan smiled sadly. "Because integrity gets quiet if you don't name it. It's not a kai." She considered that, then took his hand briefly before running back to her mother. Later that night, Jonathan stood in Grace's room, watching her sleep. The house was too big, too silent. It echoed with everything he had once postponed. He thought of his wife, of how fiercely she had believed that money was only useful if it moved toward something better, of how she would have looked at him now, not with praise, but expectation. His phone rang. It was his brother. They hadn't spoken in months. "I'm seeing your name everywhere," his brother said. "You okay?" Jonathan exhaled slowly. "No, but I'm present." A pause. Then, "You're making enemies." "I already had them," Jonathan replied. "I just didn't know." After the call, Jonathan drafted a memo he had been circling for days. It wasn't legal. It wasn't strategic. It was moral. Effective immediately, All hospitals under his control would implement independent diagnostic review boards. Whistleblower protections would bypass internal management entirely. Community oversight panels would include patients, custodial staff, and non-clinical workers. Not symbolic seats, voting ones. He knew the backlash would be fierce. He signed it anyway. Across town, a man sat in a dark office, watching the same news Jonathan had turned off. His jaw tightened as footage replayed Jonathan Hale speaking calmly, reporters shouting questions he did not answer. This wasn't the deal, the man muttered. He reached for his phone. The war, he decided, would need to escalate. Back at the Hale house, Jonathan tucked Grace in. She reached for his hand. "Daddy," she whispered. "The girl, Annie, is she my friend?" Jonathan squeezed her fingers gently. "Yes, she is." Grace smiled, satisfied, and drifted off. Jonathan stayed longer this time. He understood now that the most dangerous lies weren't the dramatic ones. They were the quiet assurances that everything was fine, that authority knew best, that children should stay silent. He would not make that mistake again. Outside, the city moved on, unaware that something fundamental had shifted beneath it. And somewhere in that movement, consequences were already catching up. The first injunction landed like a bruise you didn't notice until you touched it. Jonathan Hale was in his office at dawn, the city still half asleep, when his general counsel stepped in without knocking. She didn't sit down. "They're trying to freeze the diagnostic reforms," she said. "Emergency motion. Filed overnight." Jonathan didn't look up from the document he was reading. "On what grounds? Corporate overreach. They're arguing you're destabilizing patient confidence and interfering with existing contracts." Jonathan finally lifted his eyes. "They're afraid." "Yes," she said honestly. "And they're coordinated." Jonathan nodded once. "Good. That means we're not wrong." He stood and walked to the window. Down below, traffic began its slow crawl. Ordinary people going to ordinary jobs, trusting systems they rarely questioned. Trust, Jonathan had learned, was the most fragile currency of all. At the hospital, Annie's mother scrubbed the floor near the oncology wing, her movements slower than usual. She could feel the eyes now, not hostile, measuring. When Annie noticed, she leaned close and whispered, "They're watching you." Her mother sighed softly. "People always watch when things change." Annie frowned. "I don't like it." "I know," her mother said. "But we don't look down when we've done nothing wrong. We have to pigade." Annie straightened her shoulders, imitating the way Jonathan stood when he spoke to rooms full of adults. Later that morning, Jonathan met with a small group he trusted. Not executives, not lawyers. A nurse with 27 years of service. A janitor who had worked night shifts since the hospital opened. A retired pediatrician who had resigned quietly 2 years earlier. "This isn't a meeting," Jonathan said. "It's a warning. They will try to discredit you. They will suggest you misunderstood, exaggerated, imagined." The retired pediatrician smiled thinly. "They already tried that with me." Jonathan held her gaze. "I believe you." That word still carried weight. By noon, the media narrative shifted. Anonymous sources questioned Annie's credibility. A child, unsupervised, confused, influenced by adults with agendas. Jonathan watched the segment once, then turned the television off. In the hallway outside Grace's room, he found Annie sitting on the floor, drawing with a blue crayon. Her picture showed a tall building with many windows and 2 small figures at the base, holding hands. "Is that the hospital?" he asked. She nodded. "And that's me, and that's Grace." Jonathan crouched beside her. "Do you know what some people are saying?" She didn't look up. "That I lied." Jonathan waited. "And what do you think?" She finally met his eyes. "I think grown-ups get scared when kids tell the truth." Jonathan felt something tighten behind his ribs. "That's very wise," he said. Grace watched from the bed, her eyes moving between them. "Daddy," she asked softly, "are they mad at Annie?" "Yes," Jonathan said carefully. "Some are." Grace frowned. "That's not fair." "No," Jonathan agreed. "It isn't." That afternoon, Jonathan made a decision his advisors begged him to delay. He went public, not with anger, not with accusations, with clarity. He stood at a simple podium in a quiet room. No banners behind him, no slogans scrolling across screens. "I am not here as a billionaire," he began. "I'm here as a father who learned something too late." Questions flew. He answered none of them directly. Instead, he told a story of a child too sick to speak for herself, of systems designed to protect quietly bending under pressure, of a 6-year-old girl who saw what trained professionals ignored. "When a child tells you something is wrong," Jonathan said, voice steady, "and your first instinct is to silence her, the problem is not the child." The room was silent. Outside, reactions were immediate. Some furious, some relieved, some long overdue. That night, Jonathan received a call from a number he didn't recognize. "You should have stayed quiet," the man on the other end said calmly. Jonathan didn't ask who it was. He already knew. "If you hurt my daughter," Jonathan replied evenly, "there will be no institution large enough to hide you." A pause, then laughter, cold, dismissive. "We'll see." The line went dead. Jonathan sat in the dark for a long time after that. He thought of his wife again, of how she used to say that courage wasn't loud, it was consistent. The next morning, a second arrest was made. Then a third. Documents leaked, emails surfaced. The pattern became undeniable. Still, the pushback intensified. Funding threats, political pressure, back-channel negotiations. Jonathan refused them all. At the hospital, Annie was escorted out of a staff-only corridor by a security guard who didn't recognize her. She didn't protest. She simply said, "I was just looking." The guard hesitated, then let her pass. People were starting to remember who they were supposed to be. That evening, Jonathan found Grace sitting up in bed, staring at a photograph of her mother. "I don't remember her voice," Grace said quietly. Jonathan sat beside her. "I do. Will you tell me about her?" Grace asked. Jonathan nodded. "Every day, if you want." In the doorway, Annie watched silently, understanding more than anyone realized. Somewhere across the city, the man who had made the call slammed his fist onto a desk. "This is getting out of hand," he snapped. "If Hale won't stop, we make him." Plans shifted. Lines were crossed. The game was no longer about control. It was about survival. And the most dangerous moment, Jonathan Hale knew, was not when the truth emerged. It was when those who had buried it realized they were running out of time. The warning came disguised as routine. Jonathan Hale was reviewing overnight reports when his head of security stepped into the room, posture stiff, voice deliberately calm. "There was an incident near Grace's school this morning," he said. Jonathan's pen stopped moving. Define incident. A vehicle idled across the street longer than expected. Wrong plates. Driver left when approached. No direct contact. Jonathan leaned back slowly. He felt the familiar surge of fear, sharp and protective. But he kept his voice even. "She's safe?" "Yes. Already back home. We're increasing perimeter coverage." Jonathan nodded. Quietly, the man hesitated. "This wasn't random." "I know," Jonathan said. After the door closed, Jonathan sat alone, hands folded, staring at nothing. The truth had reached the stage where it no longer argued. It threatened. Across town, Annie sat at the kitchen table, swinging her legs while her mother folded laundry. The television murmured in the background Jonathan's face again, this time framed by commentators arguing over his motives. "They keep saying your name," Annie said. Her mother glanced at the screen, then turned it off. "People talk when they don't understand." Annie frowned. "They understand. They just don't like it." Her mother paused, studying her daughter. "Where did you learn to think like that?" Annie shrugged. "From watching." That afternoon, Jonathan called an emergency meeting with his inner circle. No assistants. No recording devices. "They're escalating," he said plainly. "We respond by tightening protection, not retreating." A senior advisor shook his head. "You're crossing from reform into open confrontation." Jonathan met his gaze. "No. They crossed it when they used my child as leverage." Silence followed. "We proceed," Jonathan continued. "But we do it cleanly. No shortcuts. No retaliation. We let the truth finish its work." Someone exhaled. "And if they don't stop?" Jonathan's answer was quiet. "Then we endure longer than they do." That evening, Jonathan visited the hospital alone. Annie and her mother were finishing up for the day. The floors gleamed under fluorescent lights, the smell of disinfectant lingering like a memory. Annie spotted him first. She waved. "You look tired," she said as he approached. Jonathan smiled faintly. "So do heroes." She laughed. "I'm not a hero." "No," Jonathan said. "You're something harder." Her mother shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Hale, Annie told me about things people are saying." Jonathan nodded. "They're saying them because they're losing ground. I'm worried," the woman admitted. "About her. So am I," Jonathan said honestly. "Which is why I want to make sure you're not alone." An example. He handed her a small card. "A direct number. No intermediaries. Day or night," he said. "You call." She took it with trembling fingers. "Why are you doing all this?" Jonathan looked at Annie, who was now kneeling on the floor, carefully tying her shoe. "Because silence almost cost me my daughter," he said. "And because I refused to teach her that speaking up is a mistake." That night, Jonathan couldn't sleep. He walked through the house, past framed photographs and rooms that still carried echoes of another life. In his study, he found himself staring at a box he hadn't opened in years, his wife's journals. He hesitated, then opened the first one at random. "If you ever read this," she had written, "promise me you won't confuse control with care. People do that when they're afraid." Jonathan closed his eyes. The next morning, a new headline broke. Whistleblower intimidation alleged. This time, the focus wasn't Jonathan. It was Annie. The language was subtle. No direct accusations, just suggestions, questions, the kind designed to make doubt feel reasonable. Jonathan read the article once, then he called the editor. "You have 24 hours, Jonathan said calmly, "to issue a correction and disclose your sources. After that, I proceed." The editor scoffed. "Are you threatening me?" "No," Jonathan replied. "I'm informing you." The line went dead. By afternoon, the correction was live. That night, Jonathan sat with Grace as she worked through her exercises, her small face scrunched in concentration. "I'm getting stronger," she announced. "Yes," Jonathan said. "You are." She looked at him seriously. "Daddy, are you scared?" Jonathan considered lying. Then he didn't. "Yes," he said. "But fear doesn't decide what's right." Grace nodded solemnly. "Mommy used to say that." Jonathan swallowed hard. Down the hall, Annie waited, clutching a book Jonathan had given her earlier. She peeked into the room. "Can I say goodnight?" she asked. Grace smiled. "You can read to me." Annie climbed onto the chair and began, her voice steady, each word careful and deliberate. Jonathan watched them and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not relief, resolve. Somewhere else, the meeting ended with slammed doors and raised voices. "She won't stop," a man snarled. "And neither will he." Then we force an ending," another replied. Plans were redrawn, timelines shortened, because the most dangerous thing about truth was not that it destroyed lies. It was that once people saw it, they stopped being afraid of the dark. The attempt came on a Tuesday. Not dramatic, not loud, just precise enough to fail. Jonathan Hale was leaving a closed-door ethics hearing when his phone buzzed twice in rapid succession. One message from security, one from a number he did not recognize. Security alert. "Do not return home. Route change in effect." The second message was simpler. "You should have taken the deal." Jonathan didn't reply. He walked calmly as his security team adjusted formation around him, ushering him into a vehicle that was not the one he'd arrived in. The engine started before the door fully closed. "Explain," Jonathan said, voice steady. "There was an attempt to access your home network remotely," the lead agent said. "Simultaneous breach attempt at the gate system. Not amateur." Jonathan nodded. "Grace? Already relocated. Annie and her mother too. That mattered more than anything else." Across town, Annie sat on a couch in a quiet safe house, her feet tucked beneath her, her hands clenched in her jacket. Her mother paced, whispering frantic questions into a phone. "They said it's temporary," Annie said, trying to sound brave. Her mother stopped pacing and knelt in front of her. "You didn't do anything wrong." "I know," Annie said. "They're just scared." Her mother pulled her into a tight hug. eyes wet. Back at the federal building, the hearing continued without Jonathan. That, in itself, became news. Speculation erupted. Absence interpreted as retreat. Silence reframed as guilt. Jonathan let it happen. By nightfall, arrests resumed quietly, deliberately. Financial crimes, coercion, obstruction. Names long protected by layers of influence were suddenly spoken out loud. The man behind the pressure watched the updates roll in from his office, jaw clenched, knuckles white around a glass he hadn't touched. "This is spiraling," he snapped. "You pushed too soon," someone replied. "No," he said coldly. "I waited too long." At midnight, Jonathan sat alone in a secure conference room, speaking with a federal judge via encrypted line. The woman's voice was tired but firm. "You understand," she said, "that this will expose more than just medical misconduct." Jonathan nodded. "I understand it will expose truth, whatever shape it takes." There was a pause. Then, "The emergency injunctions will be denied by morning. Due in Talana." Jonathan closed his eyes briefly. "Thank you." When the call ended, Jonathan leaned back and finally allowed the weight to land. Fear had been circling him for weeks. Now it had shown its face. And failed. The next morning, he arrived at the hospital before sunrise. No cameras, no announcements. He found Annie in a small room off pediatrics, sitting cross-legged on the floor, building a tower from wooden blocks. She looked up. Hi, Jonathan said, kneeling beside her. "You okay?" She nodded. "They said it was just for sleeping somewhere else." "That's right," he said. "Sometimes safety looks like change." She placed another block carefully. "The bad men are loud when they're losing." Jonathan smiled. "Yes, they are." Grace appeared in the doorway with her walker, determination written all over her face. "Daddy," she said. I walked 3 steps. Jonathan stood instantly, pride flooding through him. 3? She beamed. "By myself." Annie clapped. "You're strong." Grace nodded seriously. "So are you." The moment was quiet, ordinary, sacred. Later that day, Jonathan testified, not defensively, not emotionally. He spoke as a witness to a system that had mistaken efficiency for ethics and silence for loyalty. "I believed ownership meant responsibility," he said. "I now understand it means accountability." By evening, the final piece fell into place. A recorded conversation surfaced. Clear, unambiguous, plans discussed, children referenced as leverage. There was no spin strong enough to survive it. The man who had made the call days earlier was arrested at his home just before midnight. No spectacle, just handcuffs and consequences. Jonathan learned of it while sitting beside Grace's bed. Annie perched nearby with a coloring book. "Is it over?" Annie asked softly. Jonathan shook his head. "No, but it's turning." Grace yawned. "I don't like scary parts." Jonathan kissed her forehead. "The brave part comes after." Outside, the city slept, unaware that a long-buried pattern had finally been broken, not by force, but by a child who spoke, and adults who chose, finally, to listen. The city woke up differently the next morning, not because the streets looked changed, but because the noise had shifted. The endless arguments that once filled the airwaves softened into something more careful, measured, as if people were afraid to speak too loudly now that the truth had settled in the room with them. Jonathan Hale noticed it on his drive to the hospital. Drivers no longer honked as aggressively. A man crossing the street nodded at him, not with recognition, but with something closer to respect. Jonathan didn't mistake it for approval. It felt more like acknowledgement of a line crossed and not uncrossed. Inside the hospital, the mood was restrained but electric. Administrators spoke in lowered voices. Staff walked straighter. Posters about ethics and patient advocacy, once decorative, were suddenly read. Jonathan passed them without comment. He went directly to pediatrics. Grace was sitting up in bed, her legs dangling over the edge, her walker positioned just out of reach. Annie stood beside her, hands hovering anxiously, ready to help but unsure if she should. "I'm supposed to wait," Grace said firmly. "But I think I can do 4 today." Jonathan leaned against the wall, arms crossed, heart tight. "Only if your body agrees." Grace looked at Annie. "Will you count?" Annie nodded solemnly. Slow, Grace slid off the bed carefully. 1 step, then another. Her face tightened with effort, but she didn't stop. 1, Annie said. 2, Grace took a third step, then a fourth, wobbling but upright. Jonathan held his breath until Grace grabbed the walker and laughed, breathless and proud. I did it. Jonathan crossed the room and knelt in front of her. Yes, he said softly. You did. Later that morning, the official charges were announced. Medical fraud, conspiracy, endangerment, obstruction. The list was longer than anyone expected, and still growing. The network Jonathan had once believed was clean and efficient had been neither. He stood before cameras briefly, not to answer questions, but to draw a line. This is not a victory, he said. It is a correction, and corrections are painful. Someone shouted a question about Annie. Jonathan answered that one. She told the truth when adults didn't want to hear it, he said. That doesn't make her brave. It makes the silence around her unacceptable. By afternoon, the hospital corridors filled with inspectors and independent observers. Clipboards replaced whispers. Documentation replaced assumptions. Annie watched them with wide eyes as she sat beside her mother in the cafeteria, a grilled cheese sandwich untouched on her tray. They're all writing, she said. Her mother nodded. That's what happens when people want proof. Annie thought about that. They didn't want proof before. Everyone. Her mother didn't answer right away. Then she said, before, they didn't want to know. Jonathan joined them quietly, sitting across the table without announcement. Annie looked up. Are they going to stop now? Jonathan chose his words carefully. Some will, others won't. But now they know they can be seen. She nodded, satisfied. That helps. In the evening, Jonathan received a message he hadn't expected, from a former board member who had opposed him publicly. I was wrong. I stayed quiet because it was easier. I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed you to know. Jonathan read it twice, then archived it without reply. Some admissions were not conversations. They were starting points. That night, Jonathan stood alone in the hospital chapel. He hadn't planned to go there. His feet simply carried him. He sat in the back pew, hands folded, eyes closed. I almost missed it, he whispered. I almost missed all of it. He didn't pray for success. He prayed for vigilance. When he returned to Grace's room, Annie was already there, sitting on the windowsill, legs swinging, watching the city lights come on. It's pretty, she said. Jonathan nodded. It is. Grace yawned. Are the bad people gone? Jonathan sat beside her. Some of them. And the others? They're being watched, he said. Grace seemed to think that over. Then it's okay. Jonathan smiled faintly. Children had a way of simplifying truths adults overcomplicated. Before leaving, Annie tugged gently on his sleeve. Mr. Hale? She said. Yes. When I grow up, she said slowly, I want to help people like you. Jonathan shook his head. I hope you help people better than me. She grinned. I will. Outside, night settled over the city, heavy but calm. Jonathan knew the final chapter had not yet been written. There were hearings ahead, reforms to enforce, trust to rebuild. But for the first time since his daughter was born, he felt something he hadn't dared to name. Not relief, direction. The hearing room was smaller than Jonathan Hale expected. No grand architecture, no dramatic light. Just wood, paper, and people who understood that history rarely announced itself with spectacle. It simply arrived, asked questions, and waited for answers. Jonathan sat at the long table, hands folded, listening as testimony concluded. Not his, not Annie's, but those who had once believed they were untouchable. Words like oversight and misjudgment were offered carefully, like coins placed on a table to buy mercy. They didn't work. When it was over, the judge spoke plainly. Consequences were outlined. Oversight mandated, power redistributed. The system, for once, corrected itself without applause. Outside, cameras waited. Jonathan walked past them. He had said everything that mattered already. That afternoon, Jonathan returned to the hospital one last time as an owner. By the end of the week, the trust structure would be finalized. Independent governance. Community oversight. His name still attached, but no longer central. Power, he had learned, worked best when it stepped back. Grace was waiting for him near the garden courtyard, standing on her own 2 feet, the walker folded beside her. Annie stood nearby, holding a small paper bag. "You're late," Grace teased. Jonathan laughed softly. "I had to say goodbye to a building." Grace frowned. "Why?" "Because buildings shouldn't belong to people," Jonathan said. "They should belong to purpose." Annie held out the bag. "We made this for you." Inside was a simple drawing. 2 children, 1 tall man, holding hands beneath a sun that took up half the page. In the corner, written carefully, were the words, "We told the truth." Jonathan swallowed hard. "I'll keep this forever." Annie nodded. "That's what it's for." In the weeks that followed, life grew quieter. Not easier, just steadier. Grace returned to school part-time, her steps growing stronger, her laughter louder. Jonathan attended physical therapy sessions with her, learned the names of muscles he had never noticed before, celebrated victories no one else would have seen. Annie started school early. On her first day, she wore new shoes that still felt strange on her feet and carried a backpack nearly too big for her. Her mother walked her to the gate, eyes shining with a mixture of pride and fear. Jonathan stood at a distance, not intruding, just present. Annie spotted him and waved once. He waved back. At work, Jonathan focused on rebuilding what had been damaged, not buildings, but trust. He spoke less, asked more. Let systems answer to people instead of the other way around. Some nights were still hard. Some mornings he woke reaching for a voice that was no longer there. But grief, he had learned, did not mean stopping. It meant carrying forward what mattered. One evening, as rain tapped softly against the windows, Grace climbed into his lap with a book. "Read this one," she said. It was about a lighthouse. Jonathan smiled. As he read, Grace leaned against him, heavy with sleep. Halfway through the story, she murmured, "Daddy?" "Yes. When I grow up," she said, "I want to be brave like Annie." Jonathan kissed her hair. "You already are." ID. Across town, Annie sat at her kitchen table doing homework, tongue between her teeth, letters carefully formed. Her mother watched from the stove, tears slipping freely now that no one was watching. "Mom?" Annie asked suddenly. "Yes, baby. Do you think people will listen next time?" Her mother considered the question. "I think they'll remember." Annie nodded, satisfied, and went back to writing. Months later, Jonathan stood at a small community gathering outside the hospital garden. No stage, no speech, just people. A plaque was unveiled not with his name, but with words chosen by the staff. "In quiet places, truth is loud enough." Jonathan read it once, then stepped back. Annie tugged on his sleeve. "See?" They listened. Jonathan smiled. "Because you spoke." The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the ground. Children laughed, nurses talked, life moved forward. Jonathan Hale stood among them, no longer defined by loss alone, but by what he chose to do with it. Justice had not arrived like thunder. It had arrived like a child's voice in a room full of adults who finally stopped talking. And that, Jonathan knew, was how lasting change always began. The story reminds us that injustice often survives not because it is powerful, but because too many people choose silence over courage. Truth does not always come from authority, titles, or experience. It can come from the most unexpected voice, even a child's. When systems value control over conscience and efficiency over humanity, real harm is done quietly. The lesson is simple but demanding. Listen carefully, especially to those who are usually ignored, because moral clarity does not depend on status. Real justice begins the moment someone dares to speak and someone else finally chooses to listen. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.